You're good to go.
Everybody, Nick from New York City coming to you again. Welcome to those of you who have been with us for a few of these. To newcomers, welcome. We're going to be going over timecode and EOS today. Just a quick introduction of the panel. David Fox is our host today. Rob and Ginger are in to help with questions and make sure that we're keeping on track for you guys. Luke Delwiche is the market manager for entertainment for ETC, and he's going to be presenting. And Tom Steer is our technical product manager for networking, so he knows where all the ones and zeros go. And Tom is actually going to kick us off this morning. First, we're going to discuss what timecode is, some of the technical variants, which Tom will cover. Luke is going to take you through all of the stuff about getting timecode into a system and into a network. And then I'm going to finish up the afternoon with programming some timecode in EOS software. So if you have questions, we'll be taking question breaks. Feel free to use the Q&A section. Again, we're scheduled till about a 2-hour session. We're going to try and wrap it up for those of you who want to get to hog. And without delay, Mr. Steer, please take it away.
All right. Okay. Do I have control? Yes, I do.
Yes, you do.
All right, here we go. I have control. Excellent. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So hi, everyone. As Nick mentioned, my name is Tom Steer. I'm ETC's technical product manager for network and power control products. So this is the first in a loose series of videos. We're not really sure how many there are going to be or when we're going to release the rest. But we're going to talk about a lot of show control kind of functionality. We're going to start out today with timecode, but we've got plans in the future for other types of triggers that you might use: MIDI show control, MIDI notes, real-time clocks, OSC, other types of control. So if you have particular interest in any of those, watch this space. There'll be more to come. But today we're going to talk about timecode. We're going to talk about what it is, what different types there are, how you get it into an ETC system, and how you interact with it from our consoles. So first of all, what do you use it for? Why would you use timecode? The situations you need to use timecode are where you have things that have a set timing. For example, a musical track. The music is happening at predictable times, and you want things to happen during that track. You want lighting, automation effects to happen all at the same time. So it helps to understand a little bit of history behind timecode, and this will kind of explain why we see some of the things that we do. So the origins of timecode come from the film and TV industry. It really came about because when you're recording lots of footage in cameras and you want to edit them all together, you need everything to line up. You need your sound to line up with the picture, and you need to be able to say, okay, I want to make this cut at, 5 minutes and 4 seconds into this clip or whatever it is. So that's where timecode comes from, and that's why we see some of the things we do. So the most common form of timecode that you hear about is SMPTE, and people will talk about SMPTE, or I'm going to send you a stream of SMPTE. There's actually a couple of different varieties of SMPTE. The two varieties are called LTC and VITC. So LTC, which stands for longitudinal timecode, it's a bit of a mouthful. What that means is that the timecode is a soundtrack that was additionally encoded onto the film or the video. So you've got your normal soundtrack of people talking, actors doing their thing, but there's this additional soundtrack which is the timecode. And that tells you which frame of the video you're in. VITC we won't talk about too much. That's a way of encoding the timecode actually into the video signal. ETC doesn't have any products that support VITC, but you can get converters if you need to convert between the two. We do support LTC. So LTC, as I mentioned, is an audio signal. It's just like an audio track on the film or video. I was going to play you a sample of it, but we can't do that. So if you're interested, you can go out and find an LTC generators. They're easily available on the internet. It's a pretty nasty sound. It sounds kind of like an old-fashioned modem, so it's not something you really want to listen to too much. But it is just an audio signal. So that means that you can transport it around the same way that you do with other audio signals. Our equipment uses 3-pin XLR connectors, the standard sort of microphone type connectors, to get SMPTE into the system. You can generate it in a variety of ways. You can download free apps that can actually generate the timecode signal on your mobile phone, for example. All right, so it's this kind of nasty sounding audio signal. What information is hidden in the signal? So what's in the signal is just a time in hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. So starting at the beginning, the hours go from 0 to 23. Now, SMPTE might be directly related to the actual time that you're doing things in, or you might be using it as an offset. So 0 might mean midnight if you're using it kind of like a real time, or 0 might just mean the start of the audio track if you're just doing an offset from the start of the audio track. It only does up to 24 hours. That's all it does. It doesn't do weeks or anything like that. Then minutes and seconds, nice and easy, 0 to 59. And then frames. So frames are where this gets a little bit complicated. So like I mentioned, SMPTE was originally based around film and TV. And because of different standards worldwide, there are different frame rates for film and TV. So the common varieties that you will see are 24 frames per second. So this means that the frames number goes from 0 to 23 and then rolls over. You might see 25 frames a second. That came from European television. You might see 30 frames a second with HDTV. And then the weird one, you might see 29.97 frames a second. So how can there be 29.97 of something in a second? So this is where you'll hear the word drop frame appear. So the reason that we have this 29.97 thing is a technical thing to do with how American TV standards worked. So obviously we can't count up to 29.97 because we're going in 1 second increments. So what happens usually at the end of a frame of 30 seconds, we go from 1 second 28, 1 second 29, and then 2 seconds. But in 29.97, if we still do that because we're still counting in ones, but we get out of sync, things would be off. So that's where drop frame comes in. So what drop frame says is, okay, we're going to skip frames of the first second of every minute, except when it's divisible by 10. And that keeps the real-time clock in sync with the timecode clock. So where that really becomes important is if you're using drop frame and you need to trigger things in those first couple of frames, then watch out because they might not even be there. We may skip some numbers. So that's the main thing to watch for with drop frame timecode. All right, so that's a very quick overview of what SMPTE LTC is about. So let's, I guess, see if we've got any questions that have come in related to what I've said so far.
Oh, I'm going to go with, it was so clear nobody had any questions to ask.
Fantastic. All right, in that case, I am going to pass the ball over to Luke.
All right. Hey, everybody. The next thing to talk about is we've got this SMPTE signal, and that's great. It's being generated. As we said, it's just a sound signal. How do we get that, in this case specifically, how do we get that into our ears so we can do stuff with it? And the answer is that we have a series of gateways that can do that. And these plug in. Let's show the next, talk a bit about this. That this is a SMPTE gateway. There's two different varieties of it. They're exactly the same except for the sort of form factor of them. So the smaller one, the one you see on top, we call it the backpack form factor.
I'm sorry, Luke. We haven't seen any change. I apologize.
Oh.
There we go.
Sorry. The one you see on top here is the backpack form factor. It's smaller. It's the size of a gadget tube, for those who are familiar with that. We also have a rack mount or a half rack width variety of it, but the way they work and their options are exactly the same. SMPTE input, as Tom mentioned earlier, that's on a 3-pin XLR. And then you can connect it to either USB, and it gets its power from that USB as well, 5 volt, or to a PoE Ethernet network. And it has a display on the front, a user interface, and that's where you can kind of start playing around with some of the various possibilities with that. So as this slide shows, a very simple connection would be to have an audio device. I'm showing a tape recorder here, but it can be any audio device sending that signal to the gateway. That gateway then puts it onto USB and it goes into the console, in this case a Geo F5. Another option for that is to put it on the network. So exactly the same scenario, except that instead of using USB, you're going onto a network. I'm going to switch my camera over here now to show my little setup that I've got. So the one on the bottom, you should see this, the one I'm playing with. This is connected via USB to my laptop, which is running ETC Nomad software. And you can see that I've got time code coming in here. I'm actually using a timecode generator program on an iPad that's sending in the current time. So it's 10:13 where we are. And I have various options that I could set up here. So I can go into about SMPTE. And again, I can see the input is active. I can see the time and the rate. If on my iPad I were to go in here and change that, you can see it goes from active to inactive, and then now it's showing that I'm actually sending drop frame SMPTE, or I could change the frame rate down to 25 frames per second, and we should see that coming. As far as that generation of it, it's just a different audio signal. So there's some other options in here, but I'll show those in a moment, because on this top one, this is connected via PoE Ethernet. So the name of it is just a name that I've given it to be clear on which one's which. The bottom one is USB, the top one's network. You can see that I've set an IP address that, just like any other device, could come from a DHCP server, or you can set it manually, which is what I did here. I can say setup.
Luke, can I pause you for just 1 second?
You may.
I'm so sorry to interrupt your flow. I've had a couple of people reply saying that they were having some difficulty seeing what you were showing. So I just wanted to let people know that Luke is doing a live broadcast right now, which means what he is broadcasting from is visible via his camera. Depending on the views that you have selected, and there's a couple of options across the top of your menu bar that let you cascade how you want to see things. I find using the side-by-side view, which is the 2 squares adjacent to one another, might make it easier for you to be able to see his camera while he is talking. You can also change the size of that image by grabbing your menu bar and scrolling things around so that you can choose what you'd like to see. That may help make it a little easier for things to show up for people to be able to see it. So Luke, if you wouldn't mind advancing the slides, at least one slide, we should be able to follow along a little bit better. Thank you so much.
Great. So yeah, what we're seeing here is that I've got this top gateway on the network directly on PoE, and I can go in and change some settings. You'll notice that the time is not counting up and down, and that's simply because I don't actually have any time code coming into this one. If I were to go and unplug from the USB one, which is more difficult than you'd expect, there we go. Unplug that time signal in here. We should now see this counting up, he says confidently. There we go. So I want to show a little bit of the configuration part of this as well. So some of you may be familiar with the program Net3 Concert. And I'll bring that up here. So I did a discover devices, and I can just show that quickly. If I say network map, this is going to go out and it's going to find all of the devices on my little network here. And it should find a few of them. It should find a network MIDI gateway, which we'll talk about in a moment. the network SMPTE gateway, which is this one, and EOS is running here, and this is me. So I can do a lot of those same settings that I did at the front panel directly with Concert if it's on the network. I can change a lot of different things. One thing that I want to talk about is this option, which is the RX ID, and that's available here. I go back to my camera. If I say set up source IDs, you can see that this is set to 2. And the easiest way to think of this, at least for me, is to think about it as like a universe of SMPTE. We can connect multiple different SMPTE gateways on the network, and we can do a different action, and Nick is going to show this with each time code stream coming in, but each one needs to be assigned to a different ID. So I've got my bottom one set to 1, although because it's connected with USB, it's always kind of number 1 anyway. When they're on the network, that's when it becomes important to set a different ID for each one. And Nick can show that a little bit more when he starts talking about that. Any questions on what we're seeing right now? I'm happy to answer those. Otherwise, we can move on, and I could pass the ball to Nick. I do see a question coming in. Can the gateways generate their own time signal? And it looks like the answer to that is no. They're not designed to generate their own timecode signal. They're a conversion box. So they're taking a timecode in from an exterior source and then putting it onto the network or onto USB for EOS, or we'll talk about it in a bit, potentially other programs to use.
Thank you. Other question that came in, what about built into the console?
Yeah, it's a good question. We decided not to build it into the console because for a few reasons. One, any kind of connector and technology that you build into the console makes the console more expensive, and I would venture a guess that 99% of the people are not using a timecode signal coming into the desk. Probably an even better reason is that often running a long audio cable from wherever that source is all the way to the console is not the greatest idea. You'd rather place the SMPTE gateway close to that source and then distribute it on the network over in Soundland or whatever the case might be.
Thank you. Great answer. Are gateways the only way to get timecode into an EOS console?
They are the only way to get SMPTE timecode in. We're going to talk about MIDI timecode in a moment, but yes, they are the only way to get SMPTE in. There was a previous piece of hardware we had called the Net3 show control gateway, and that will also work. That's a legacy product, and the new SMPTE gateway has replaced that.
Thank you. What is the difference between the two sizes of SMPTE gateway that you were showing?
The only difference is the size, is really that. It kind of depends. If you're looking for a more portable solution, and that's why we call it the backpack form factor, that might be a better choice. But if you're permanently installing it or mounting it in an equipment rack, probably that half rack width option might be better, or tabletop as well. It does. I've had to use Velcro to kind of hold mine in place here. So obviously, if you're setting it on the desktop, that might be a better option. Besides that, they're the same.
Thank you. Rob's asking, are third-party gateways allowed to get SMPTE into EOS?
You know, there's not really a standard for distribution of SMPTE signal digitally. So the only gateway that we support is the response and the previous generation, our gateways, in order to do that.
Thank you. Two questions. I'll ask the more difficult one first. Is it possible to see the backside of the equipment that you have in the camera?
It sure is.
Right.
While you're the next question, and I will.
I was going to say, while you flip, I will ask a couple of the other questions that are coming up as well. And if any of our panelists can answer them while Luke is otherwise entertained. that would be fantastic. Does ETC have a gateway that offers both MIDI and LTC SMPTE options in a single device?
And I can grab that one. Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah, so we used to have the show control gateway, which did have both of those connectors on it. It was more expensive, and we had to discontinue it due to parts obsolescence. So we, instead of recreating that device, we split it into two less expensive devices, assuming that most folks would need one or the other. Therefore, you're not paying more for half of a thing you don't need. So out of current products, no, we do not.
Thank you. Thank you. John asks a technical question, which is, what is the maximum length of an audio cable that can be used to connect SMPTE to the gateway?
Yeah, I can take that one. It's difficult to give a hard and fast number because what happens with audio signals, unlike digital signals generally either work or they don't, but audio signals kind of degrade slowly. What we use on the SMPTE gateway is a balanced audio input. There we go, we can see it on the big screen right now, which is reasonably robust, probably up to somewhere in the region of 1,000 feet would be fine. And you can use audio signal amplifiers and things like that to boost the distance of the signal if you need to.
Excellent, thank you. Luke, it looks like you're ready to show us the backside of water here. So can, I'll stop talking so you can
see that. I can turn up the gain on the camera a little bit there. But it's a very simple back panel. You either have your USB connector, which is how this one is connected, or your PoE connector. I will mention that on the tabletop or half rack width gateways, you do have the option to actually open the top and move this connector to the front if that's a more useful location for your installation. And then we have the SMPTE input here, and this is a 3-pin XLR. It's actually the same as what you're seeing on the backpack form factor. And then the side of this one, in case that's useful, this has just the PoE Ethernet, which is an Ethercom, and again, the USB connector. Hopefully that was useful.
I think so. We've had a couple of people that have had some camera issues, and I do apologize for that. We're trying new and different technologies every time we run these sessions. So sometimes we'll learn from some of this. So there is going to be a recording version of this. The recording should make things a little bit easier to see if you're having some trouble seeing some of the camera stuff. We've had a couple other questions come in, but I would suggest we hold those to the end because there's a few of them that I think are going to get answered in the next portion of our presentation.
Mm-hmm. The next thing really is for, I think, Nick to take over and talk a little bit about once the SMPTE is on the network or on the USB and coming to EOS, what do we do with it? And I'll pass the ball to Nick.
Hey everybody. Yeah, so Tom covered what timecode is and what its uses are. Luke talked about the hardware that we use to get these signals into either a network or via USB into a device. So I'd like to talk about programming that sort of stuff, right? So when we, let me make sure I'm on the right slide. There we go. When we talk about programming these show control tools, we're assuming that you're getting the signal in the console. I wanted to add a little thing, the question that was asked about why you would not want it directly plugged into a console. For those of you that were on our multi-console system webinar a few weeks ago, another big reason is backup, right? So if you have a time code, either SMPTE or MIDI, going into a single device, and that is the device that fails, then you have no ability to transfer that to your backup. So we're using things on the network to distribute that time code to the whole system, and then other devices can pick that up. If you're using clients in EOS, they're actually reading the time code directly off of the wire, right? So, so we just want to make sure that as soon as we get that stuff into our system, we're distributing it to all the devices that need it. So if you think about the multi-console conversation that we had a couple weeks ago, this plays exactly in how EOS distributes this system information. So when we want to program with show control, one of the first things we need to do is turn on time code. So in our show settings, there's show control settings where we can enable SMPTE timecode and MIDI timecode receiving. Obviously, if those are disabled, they won't work. So check there first. And then if you're using USB to bring SMPTE or MIDI timecode into a device, either a console or Nomad, you need to make sure that this is enabled, right? If this is disabled, those won't function. So just be cognizant of that. One of the tabs that we utilize to deal with show control is the show control tab. And as Tom alluded to at the top of all of this, there are lots of different things that have to do with show control and external triggers that we can use to do things within EOS. And all of this is in the event handler or show control list. So we have a couple of things in here. If you're familiar with your QList index, you've got a list of your lists on the bottom of this display, and then at the top of the display are the individual components. So in the QList list, it's a list of your QList at the bottom and the individual queues. In your show control list, it's a list of all the event lists and all the events that they contain. So that's the structure of that tab. When we look at an individual list, there's a bunch of different settings that we need to make sure are set properly if we expect that time code that's on our network to do anything in our system. And the first is the type. So is this a SMPTE timecode list? Is it going to respond to that? Is it a MIDI timecode list? And what's good about EOS is SMPTE and MIDI structurally are the same, right? When you start to talk about frames, the time, there isn't really a difference in how they're structured. And so SMPTE and MIDI in EOS, the only difference is the type. Everything else that you program is going to function the same. And that actually allows you, if for some reason your rig changes, maybe you're on tour, deciding whether your SMPTE or MIDI is super easy. This is also where you set other trigger options, which again, we're only talking about show control today. But as we go through other sessions in the future, we'll set other trigger options here as well. The next thing, as Luke alluded to, is your source. And all of the different options on our gateways have what's called a gateway, a group ID. And a group ID just is our way of handling multiple input sources of the same type. So for example, if you needed 2 or 3 or 4 SMPTE inputs to trigger various things, right? Maybe you're doing an experiential walkthrough show and you have 5 different rooms running different audio tracks. You could have 5 different inputs, and we would handle that with a group ID. So whatever the group ID is set to on the gateway as the input, that's what you want to match your source to in EOS. So this is going to listen to source 1 and respond to it and allow those events to trigger. The other things that are part of this are your internal and your external time clocks. So your internal setting will enable or disable the standalone time clock within EOS, whereas your external time clock will enable or disable whether or not we're responding to outside input. And this is kind of important, right? If you think about what we use timecode for, we're often not using timecode to stand alone, right? Timecode is built for synchronization. We are there as a subsystem of a larger scheme, right? Maybe we want to synchronize to audio because there's a track that we want to synchronize our lighting to. Maybe video is providing the time code. Maybe it's like a theme park show where everything runs at the top. There's a master time clock, and everything listens and triggers stuff at the known time. The point being that you can run stuff internal, and when we go over to my demo, we'll look at that sort of stuff. And that's a great way to test stuff out and to build stuff. But at the end of the day, EOS isn't sending timecode back out. We're not generating it. We're not distributing it. So consider whether timecode is actually the right application, or if using things like queue timing, follows and hangs, those sorts of things are more appropriate for your response. But keep in mind that the reason that the timecode features exist in the way that they do in EOS is because we expect it to be connected to other systems. I'll say from sort of a New York theater standpoint, we're actually seeing a lot more adoption of timecode into commercial theater. And that really has to do with directors and audiences wanting tighter turns and more sort of poppy, spectacular things. So the orchestra will be on click track, the sound effects and the lighting and video and effects, all of those things will be synchronized together for musical moments, and then we're going back to manual operation for book scenes and things like that. And the reason I kind of mention that is there's a little bit of there's different behaviors based on what your settings for your internal and your external time clock are. So it kind of matters what they do together, not just individually. So obviously, if both of them are set to off, the internal time clock isn't running, and any external sources that are contributing to source one are ignored. We don't listen to timecode, so events won't happen. If your internal time clock is on, we're going to start running that internal time clock, and it'll stop when it's disabled. Again, that's a great way to sort of pre-program things, set timestamps, and sort of learn your events without an additional source being connected. So that's a useful thing to run on its own. When you have the internal time clock off and the external time clock on, what you will see is a wait for input message. And that means that the events are only going to run when the external source is present and streaming in timestamps. And so this is actually production mode, right? This is when we want to have the system wait for input from an external source for synchronization. And then there's sort of a backup system. So when you have both internal and external on, once again, we'll have a waiting for input status notification. And the clock is going to start running when the external source is present, right? So we're listening to the external time, we're synchronizing, but if for whatever reason the external source goes away, there's a blip in the line, somebody chews through an audio cable, whatever happens, the internal time clock takes over, right? So it will start at the last timestamp it received and continue trying to count. Again, because it's a standalone time source, it may not be exactly in sync with everything that's being broadcast on the time. When the external source returns, if it pops back up, then the system lets its internal time clock recede. The external time clock, it will resynchronize with that time, and it will return to external control. So there is a nice little backup in the system if you're worried about the robustness of your connection. So know that both of those on is actually useful for production. Other things in list settings, we have first time and last time that our internal clock is basically allowed to process, right? And if it gets to a last time, it just loops to the beginning of the first time. So that's a way for you to sort of narrow the scope of what a particular list will respond to. And then the status is, first and foremost, what time is it, right? As Tom alluded to, this could be real time or this could be relative time. A lot of TV networks will put their time code in sync with real time, so that things like TV shows, commercial breaks, all sync up properly with broadcast. But in a theater setting, time is relative, right? I mean, generally that's the case, but specifically with time code, we kind of want to know what time is it. And as we're teching numbers, we'll look at this when I look at my demo file, but as we're teching numbers, we might want to shift what time we're at in a production cycle so that we can jump to a particular number. So time and show control can be really, really relative, especially as we get into production stuff. The other thing that it will show you in the status area is what your sources are doing right now, and whether you are in a learning mode, which we'll talk about, and whether or not you're in a silent mode. And silent mode is another way to ignore time clock events coming in. So the other part of your show control tab is the top part, which is your events. And events are easy to type in, right? You can say in your event list, if you know where all your cues are and you know what time they're supposed to go, it's as simple as typing in, I want to put event 1 time 1 second, right? I need to type in 100 to sort of pass by my frames, enter, and that's going to give me the timestamp, and then I can add an action. So event 1, Q1, enter. When it is 1 second in time, whenever EOS hears 1 second come in as a timestamp, it's going to execute a go on Q1. Other things that we can trigger are submasters and macros, and so those are really useful. If you want to bump a particular sub in time, you set the time on the submaster, it can trigger that bump up, and it will respond with all of the sub stored timing. You can also do macros for any other things that you may want to have happen that isn't playback related. You can string a lot of this together, right? To time, 2 seconds, 12 frames, Q2, enter. That'll put it all together. And then obviously all these events can have labels if you want to give them some context. One thing to keep in mind in our event list is event numbers are not fixed. And what I mean by that is if you delete event 2, you don't go from event 1 to event 3. We use the event numbers in whole numerical order as a way to just get your ability to type something on the command line to reference them. We actually organize the event list by time. So if you add something that's at a different time, it's going to actually reorganize itself to show you that. So the event number is more of a command line function so that you can access that event when you're editing it rather than a fixed target number like we use with queues. So just keep that in mind. It isn't a bad thing, it's just an organizational thing. So typing in events is certainly one way to do it. Another way that we can get our events timestamped is to learn things, right? So learn events is a soft key in the show controls tab, and it's actually called SC learn, show control learn. And it learns what you press go on, and it learns what you're doing with your subs and your macros. So anything when you're in a learn mode, just like when you learn a macro, anything you do gets registered as a timestamp when it happens. So if you're trying to do something that's a bit more busky, or you've got several cue lists together, or you just want to run a single cue list and learn that in the system while you play back the music or whatever, then learning is great. Make sure that if you expect to learn a cue list, that you check what your master fader pair is configured to. If you're hitting go on your master fader pair and you're expecting to learn cue list 2 and cue list 1 is loaded, you're going to be learning cue list 1. So just make sure before you start to learn stuff that you're set up so that you get the result that you are expecting. The other thing is that this soft key only exists in the show control tab. So, you know, hitting the show control learn and then going out into live and making sure your clock is right and all this can take some time. So a lot of times, one of the most practical things for show control, and we'll see this as we go through some more examples, is that we macrotize a lot of this stuff, and we'll build up banks of things so that we can have quick access in live where we want to be for all of our tools. So a quick view, I'll show you some more of my macros in a second, but you'll notice that these macros, I learn with the event list number, right? So my soft key in my macro editor, event 1/, just like I'm dealing with queue lists, event 1/ is my whole list. So I can say event 1/ learn events, which is my soft key, and hit enter. Just like a lot of other settings in EOS, if you just say event 1/ learn events, it's going to toggle that state to whatever the opposite is of what it's currently in. And that's a little unpredictable, right? Am I enabling learning or am I disabling learning? If it's just toggling, I may not know where I'm at. So use your soft keys in your macro editor and make 2 separate targets, 2 separate macros that will always enable the learn or always disable the learn, so that it's a little bit safer and more predictable. Because this is list specific, if we have multiple event lists, we're going to want to have multiple macros for that sort of thing. The other thing that's really important here is this field in macros called sclearn. By default, this is enabled because when you're learning show control, you can learn macros directly into your event list. As you're triggering all these macros, you may not want them to be involved. So the first thing that I recommend to people is if you're using any sort of show control, go through your macros and every sclearn field should be disabled. Unless there is a specific thing that you want to learn into timecode as a part of what you're putting together, you should opt into that, right? You don't want to be changing pages or executing snapshots and having all that stuff happening when really all you wanted to learn was your cue goes. So just be aware that this field is incredibly useful for while you're learning show control, but that you need to go in and set all of your macros ideally to disabled, and then if you need them in the sake of show control, you can enable it and have that be a part of it. Other little things that are just niceties in here. This has nothing to do with show control, but it's one of those little known, not very well documented things. Anytime you put a double pipe in a label, you get a carriage return for things like direct selects and things like that. So we'll look at my macros in a second, but it's no accident that all of my direct select buttons are very cleanly laid out so I can quickly scan them and get what I want. A double pipe in a label in a target will wrap that text for you. So nothing to do with show control, but it's a little bonus and it helps keep you organized. There are lots of other macros that make learning show control easy, right? Again, we want to do this out in live where we're set up. So on a per list basis, depending on how many event lists you're using, as we talked about, you want enables and disables for external and internal time. You want to be able to enable and disable learning so that you can quickly pop in and out of that. And then again, you want to be able to set the clock to specific times. When I talk about sort of the musical theater model that is in commercial theater in New York and other places, a lot of times we will ascribe an hour to a musical number. And that's so there's not overlap when, the clock maybe runs a little longer because whoever's generating it, the audio department or whoever forgets to turn it off. We're not popping into different places, right? And I think that that's a key thing to remember is if EOS hears a timestamp on the network and there is something to go with that time, it's going to take you to that part of the show. So in a show where I have 500 cues and my time happens to run or the audio department happens to accidentally play timestamps for a part of the show that are, 45 minutes from now, the console's going to jump there. And so silent mode is another thing that we use, which says, I just don't want to respond to any input, right? So in the tech process in particular, if we're working on notes, and audio suddenly sends out a timestamp intentionally or otherwise because of notes that they're working on, I don't want my system drug with them because that time was fired into my system. So we'll use enable and disable silent mode macros in order to prevent those playbacks from happening. Another thing to keep in mind, and I didn't build an example of this, but I think it's worth discussing. When we talk about sort of musicals in general, where the book sections are being run manually by the operator and the musical sections are being time coded, what we'll actually do is a cue or two before the musical section, that cue will execute a macro that disables silent mode, right? So that any time in the process we're not worried about it because we want silent mode to be on by default, but we're getting ready to go into a musical number where we want to listen to time code, we'll have a macro from that cue, enable time code, disable silent mode so that we can listen to it. That time code will come in, it will take us through that musical number, and then a cue or two after we're done with time code, we'll have another macro fire that re-enables silent mode. So it's a protective thing, right? We want to make sure that only portions of our show that we want to listen for time code are listening for time code. And if you have any specific examples about that, let me know. But it's just executing a macro that enables and disables silent mode. And because we're setting ourselves to specific locations in the show, sometimes we want to set our clock to be at specific times so that we can run from a certain number or be in a certain place. So those are macros that are perless and very useful. Things that are global, I think one of the most powerful things about editing time code is you can add or subtract relative time. I'm going to show an example of this when we get into the show file. But basically, you can say in live, I just want to shave a couple of frames off of this, or I want to shave a second off of this, or I want to add 2.5 seconds to this. So having macros that relatively add time to a cue or chunks of cues, right? I can say cue 1 through 5, enter, cue execute time code, plus, and add 4 seconds to the whole chunk, and they'll remain relative in their time. Don't forget that when we do relative time adjustments, you can't just say minus if you want to go in the minus direction because the console thinks that that's a negative time. You have to say execute time code plus minus, and that's how the system knows that it's an offset as opposed to a negative integer. So keep that in mind. The other thing that is great to have macros for is to delete all the events in a list for relearning. So if you have a list that's tied to a section of music, you may want to relearn that all over again. And you actually have to delete the events in the list in order to do that. If you just relearn that, you'll actually get double timestamps. So when it's 2 seconds on the clock, it'll play Q2. And when it's 2 seconds, 3 frames on the clock, it'll play Q2. So just be really careful of double entering things when you're relearning. You kind of need to reset that portion of the event list, which is why it may behoove you to have multiple event lists that listen to the same SMPTE group, but are set for different time ranges. Again, in sort of a commercial theater example, if I've got 9 musical numbers, I may have 9 separate event lists that are set to specific hours, so I don't have to worry about accidentally deleting other events when I'm trying to relearn a certain section of the show. So a lot of this is pretty straightforward and has to do more with workflow than it does necessarily with the features of the desk. And I think playing and practicing will get you to develop your own. One of the things that is useful is you can view timestamps in your external links column in your PSD, so you can actually see what time these things will get called at. in order to do that, you need to pop into your cue list index and just link that cue list with the timecode list. And the syntax of that in your cue list index is q1 slash, right, whole list, execute timecode 1 slash. That'll link those together. That'll allow you to see your timecode. You know, a lot of stuff gets populated in the external links column. Sometimes we want to see our timecode, sometimes we don't. So just keep in mind that you'll want to do that. If you're creating events in your event list, they're not going to show up until you link that. So just be aware of that. Okay. I have I mean, these stock photo people are super excited. I hope you all are as well. I'm just going to screen share my EOS Offline stuff. Do we feel like doing a couple of questions before I hop in? Or?
Yeah, I think that might be helpful. There's a couple of questions that have come in that I think would be good to look at and pause here to talk about. Number one, if you use a fader when you are learning the time code, how is the up-down movement of that fader recorded?
So we don't record like movement of a fader. We record bump and timing behavior, right? So we're not learning you doing all of these intricate moves as you go up and down and the relative timing between them. It's something that we've discussed but doesn't exist in the code right now. So when you're learning a submaster, you're learning the bump button and its associated timing parameters. In our training videos, we have information about all of that with uptime, dwell time, downtime. If you're trying to do something more complicated than that, that's exactly why we let you learn a macro into the system. So good question.
Excellent. Just like 2 or 3 more.
Yeah.
You had mentioned live musicals and New York stuff where you have SMPTE being generated with a live orchestra and a whole bunch of different people listening to it. What is typically the device that is generating that signal?
Yeah, there's a lot of different devices. Again, it's just an audio signal. It really depends on the production teams that are involved. Oftentimes, the audio department is responsible for generating the time code simply because it is an audio signal and they have the means to distribute it. But that is by no means required. So it really depends on the production and who needs to be in charge of what time it is. So there's nothing that says this is the group that has to do it. In certain applications where they're automated shows, you know, maybe like a theme park show or something, a lot of times stage management is in charge of what time it is because they're working with house management and things like that. And those are systems that there are no operators, right? The whole thing is automated. So the audio tracks, the lighting effects, any automation, you know, those little half-hour type variety shows oftentimes have a single person that's making sure everything's operating safely, but a lot of the subsystems are tied directly to a time code. So that's a clock that's like its own department, its own level. Same with broadcast, right? Broadcast time is broadcast time. CBS, NBC, all of those sort of major networks have their time, and we just listen to what time it is if we're doing any sort of those triggers that aren't relative to a production. So it really
click track like the click track, for example, and this is a question that Joshua had asked. Is that something the conductor would start, or is that something where whoever this master timekeeper, be it audio or stage management or video production or whomever, decides to say, okay, we are starting the show, I am clock master, I am saying go. Does the click track then come from the conductor, or would the click track start with SMPTE?
That's a great question. More and more often, as conductors are getting comfortable with it, at least in the New York commercial market, the conductor is the one that's starting that sequence, right? They want to have control of when the music starts and when the moment is. But once they get it started, that click track is helping them keep the tempo so that other things line up to the music. So it's sort of a live orchestra's way of performing like a track.
Right.
And oftentimes we're seeing the conductor execute that first go. So good question.
Perfect. Thomas jumped into this conversation as well to say, because live theater always follows the exact parameters of a computer-controlled clock. What happens if you need to suddenly jump the clock, or what happens with manual inputs? And I think you'd answered this before.
Yeah.
If the clock shifts, does how does the event list affected?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that I constantly complain to our development team about is that EOS does what you tell it to do, not what you want it to do. So if you get a signal that comes from timecode that says that it's suddenly 23 hours, 43 minutes, 36 seconds, and 4 frames, and you were in hour 1 and you have an event there, that's where it's going, right? So this is why we like to ride with either external timing disabled or with silent mode on, except when we are expecting timecode. So that's a good working practice. Again, EO's going to do what it hears, what you don't do. So be smart about how you're programming these things. I think from a standpoint of operations, it may also be good to have your operator have some overrides, right? Maybe there's a magic sheet or some macros that are available in a easily accessible space while they're operating that allows them to disable timecode and run it manually. I think that that's always a good option to give your operator to have out, right? Something's gone haywire. We're disabling timecode for the rest of the show. And the operator will run it as best they can, right? The reason we're going on to timecode is that a lot of the things that we're trying to do now, especially in these big, heavy rock musicals, is big, fast, quick movement that is nearly impossible for a stage manager to call and for an operator to manually keep up with. So that's the why. That's why we're going on to these things. If it's a musical number that's a lot slower and an operator can keep up, do you need to go to timecode? These are things that you need to discuss with your production, because with timecode comes a lot more responsibility and complexity, right? So what are the advantages that it's bringing you versus the work that you have to put into it? I think those are questions you need to ask yourself. So good question.
Yeah, no, those are. I get a little passionate about this conversation, but it's my time to ask you questions. So I will wait. I've got a couple of different types of questions that have come in that are kind of threaded, where multiple people have asked questions along a similar topic. So let me throw what those topics are out before we go further.
Yeah.
And then you can tell me if this is a good time to answer those questions or if this is something you're going to cover later. But we had a number of questions coming in specific to queue lists versus event lists or multiple event lists when you're trying to run stuff. We've also had a number of questions that have come in specific to working with silent mode and triggering silent mode on and off.
Sure.
Are these things that you'd want to cover now, or do you want to cover them in a little bit?
Triggering silent mode, I've actually got some macros for, so we can look at that in the show file.
Okay. Okay. I'll hold these. I'll hold these then until we get to until we get into the show file. So
that's great.
What about event list stuff?
Yeah, so I think EOS is really open, right? Right now, there's not really any filtration on who's called by what event list or what queue list can be ascribed to who. And that's why I said you have to be really cautious when you go to learn stuff. A single event list can call queues from multiple queue lists.
How many SMPTE lists can you have inside the console?
We allow you to do 24 discrete SMPTE sources. I think that got up to 32 with the new response gateways. I don't know how many individual event lists you were allowed. I think we're allowed 999. I don't know how many can be active at the same time. I'd have to look into that. But it's a lot. We do big shows where we're listening to 20, 25 sources of time code coming into the system at a time. So if you're working on a show that's much bigger than that, you should reach out, because we want to help out what you're doing. But suffice to say that we can take in multiple timecode sources and other inputs at once and have individual lists respond to that stuff. And that's why I call it an event handler, because it's listening to timecode, and as it sees what time it is, it's triggering those events between different submasters, different macros, and different queue lists. Similarly, and what can get you into trouble is a single queue list can listen to multiple event lists. So if you just copy an event list, and all those queues were set to queue 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you've got a second list now doing that, that's going to trigger it, right? If you've got that all set up. So just be really cautious. I personally, when I deal with timecode in a show with multiple sources, like to kind of sketch out how I expect the data flow to happen, and document that, right? The other thing is that making sure other people can use the system and maintain the system, if it's going to be something that you have to walk away from and leave with an operator, or it's a museum piece or something like that. So so you got to be cautious, because it's flexible, but that also means you got to know what you're doing.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Hey, Nick, one clarification.
Yeah, right.
You just said, hi. You just said a single queue list can listen to multiple event lists. I don't think that is true, and I just told someone in chat that that is not true. So can you clarify?
Yeah, so if, it can, in that if I have event list 1 calling queues 1 through 5 in queue list 1, and I have event list 2 calling the same or other queues in queue list 1. If event list 1 and event list 2 are operational, then they're both going to be able to trigger the queue list 1. So does that make sense?
But a queue list can only be associated with one event list. Like you can't find multiple lists.
You can't put multiple timecode lists in that execute area, and that execute area in the queue list index is not a filter, right? So if you still have queue 1 being called in event list 2, it's still going to trigger it, right? So that's why I said you just got to proceed with caution, because right now, if it is in an event list and that event list gets a timestamp, it's going to activate that regardless of what your queue list is associated with. I'm not saying that filters aren't desirable. I'm saying right now that they don't really work, right? So just be cautious. Okay? I know this is something that the development team, as we go through cycle to cycle, there's already been a lot of improvements in the back end of this stuff. And so, as 3.0 and 3.1 and other things come out, look for cleanups, changes, additions. This is something that, I know that is being discussed and worked on constantly. So.
Cool. Thank you. To go a step further into the details of some of this, Matthew had asked a question, and Matthew was one of the people that actually requested that we do this session, so it's nice to see some questions coming in. Linking back to a multi-console session from earlier in the week, if you have queue lists 1 and 2 linked, do you need to link both queue lists to timecode, or does timecode trigger list 1, which would then trigger list 2?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Basically, all a timecode call on a queue list is an automated go, right? When that timestamp is received by the event handler, it sends a go to that queue list. So if you have anything that is linked to that queue list, like another queue list, if you have executes that are in the field in the queue list, all of that stuff will work fine, right?
So you'd only need to have one of them in the event. You'd only need to have one of those queue lists linked.
Exactly. Yeah, and the reason that we would take in, if you're doing something like complicated effects and you need 2 queue lists for that, that's exactly how we would want to structure it, right? Because those things always want to play back together and be in the same place together. It's when we talk about things like walkthrough theater, where you have 10 rooms that are on their own kind of timeline, and you want those rooms individually synchronized with other systems, that we would take in multiple sources and allow those things to stay in sync with their subsystems that are in that same room. So
thank you. How do I associate a queue list with multiple event lists? Is that something you'll cover in demo time?
We can kind of talk about it. So the associating an external link thing, I don't think it does what we think it does, where it says only this event list will trigger this queue list. So I guess I don't think there's a way to do what you're asking for, which is to say this thing always only works with this event list. The way that we do that is that we put events that are only queue list 1 or whatever. There's nothing that will stop you from saying in event list 1, I also want to trigger something from queue list 2, or vice versa. So you got to be really cautious about that.
Thank you. Thank you. We've had a couple other questions come in, but I know we want to move forward. I see before we move away from this, though, there are 2 technical SMPTE questions that have come in that I don't know that we're going to hit later, and I think it would be good to just, if it's okay with you guys, to get another voice in here just to answer a few of these technical questions. One of the questions that came in was asking what type of SMPTE is being generated by the gateways, but I got a secondary follow-up because we answered that question already, which is which frame languages is the gateway capable of speaking? Is it 30? Is it 29.7? How do I select the frame rate that the gateway is listening or broadcasting?
Sure. Yeah, I can answer that one. So just to be clear, the gateway doesn't generate SMPTE, right? We don't make anything that sends SMPTE out. We only receive SMPTE. We listen to other people's SMPTE. And the frame rate is automatically detected by the gateway. So it supports any frame rate you care to send to it. You don't have to do any setup. That's just an automatic detection.
Fantastic. Along that similar line, a question asked by John, one of my best friends in the world. Hi, John. Is there a set number of frames to get timecode to sync to an external sort?
Yeah. So currently in the new response SMPTE gateways, there is a 1 second sync time. So once you start sending it timecode, it will be 1 second before it starts sending that out on the network. The reason for that is it's actually detecting what frame rate it's being sent, so it can tell EOS that information because that's not encoded into the SMPTE signal. That's something that we are maybe going to look at in the future to see if we can make that quicker, because we've had a couple of specific cases where that 1 second was a little annoying delay. But at the moment, 1 second.
Perfect. I think that's what we've had that has come in. Obviously, we have some other questions. Some of you are still waiting on some questions to be answered, and they will be, but we are trying to sort some of this in flow. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just hop on Tom's thing. There is a setting in EOS which is resync frame. By default, it's set to 2, and that determines when we see frames off of the network, how long until we resync to it, how many frames do we have to see. By default, that's 2. You can expand that if you need to, if you're having some weird issues. But that's there for that. So there you go. I am going to attempt to share my screen.
Well, Nick, before you do that, we've had a number of questions come in, and they're related to MIDI and MIDI timecode. So I wanted to take a step back and talk about MIDI timecode for a moment. Okay. We actually have some slides on that we could go through. I'm not sure if I'm able to. Yeah, I am. Good. So Tom was going to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we've had a couple of kind of questions that have come in, and maybe we should just take a little step back here. So we've been talking a lot about timecode just as a general concept here, but there's really a couple of different varieties of timecode that we're playing with. So the first one that we talked about was simply the kind of timecode that comes in as an audio signal. We've also got internally generated timecode, right? So Nick was showing you how you can use the internal timecode generator in the console to experiment with timecode without any kind of external sources or anything hooked up. It's just generating its own timecode. MIDI timecode is another variety. So MIDI comes from the musical instrument industry. It stands for Musical Instrument Device Interface. So it was originally about hooking up keyboards. So when I press the middle C key on my keyboard, that information is shared with the synthesizer. It's been around for a long time, and MIDI has been expanded and expanded to do more and more things. So it gets a little bit confusing because when we talk about MIDI, there are multiple different aspects to it. In some future presentations, we're probably going to talk about things like MIDI show control and MIDI notes. But there is a way of running timecode over MIDI. So that means you're using the physical MIDI cables, the 5-pin things like you can see on the right-hand side, but running timecode over those. So we support that as well. It basically is exactly the same information as in SMPTE timecode, except it's now as a digital MIDI signal instead of an audio signal. You can buy converters that convert from one to the other. So we support both of those. So really, all of these flavors of timecode, once they're into the console, we kind of treat them in the same way, and you can switch between them. You can use one or the other. And they're all about a continuous stream of time and events that happen within that time. Now, a lot of the other show control things that we'll talk about in some future sessions are more event-based. So you can say, okay, when this contact is closed, or when I receive this OSC command, at that specific event, do a thing. Right, so that's kind of the dividing line here. Is today we're talking about timecode. We've talked about the different ways of getting timecode into the system, different signals, MIDI, SMPTE, and once it's in, all of those things that you can do that. We'll tackle some of the other things like OSC, contact closures, that type of thing, in some future sessions. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody.
Very good. Shall we hop into demo mode?
I was just going to point out that there's a separate gateway, and this is the MIDI response MIDI gateway that's used to take MIDI timecode, or indeed any MIDI signal, and put it into EOS. It operates in very much the same way, looks very much like the SMPTE one. The big difference that you'll see is that these gateways actually have an in, through, and an out port. SMPTE only has the in. For the purposes of timecode, the only one we're going to be using is the in. We're not sending timecode, as Tom said earlier. We're only receiving it. But the setup of this is largely the same as what you would see with the SMPTE gateway. The kind of neat thing is that, and Nick talked a little bit about this, EOS is kind of agnostic about what is generating that timecode. Your programming is exactly the same, whether it's MIDI timecode, SMPTE timecode, or indeed using the internal clock. And there have been a number of questions about, is there some way that I can generate this so that I can pre-program at home? And the answer, Nick has talked about this, is yeah, you can generate it without an external signal at all, do all of your pre-programming, whether it's ETC Nomad or on a desk, and then that's directly transferable once you're in the real space getting a real timecode signal. But yeah, I think demo would be great, Nick.
Couple of quick questions before we move into demo. I promise, Nick, this is the last time I'm going to keep you from showing your demo because I know it's really cool and I want to see it too. But I just a couple of things here. We've just as a kind of a general disclaimer, if you will, we've had a number of people that have brought in some questions about OSC and comparing and contrasting OSC, and I'd like to just say, we may be able to answer some of those at the end of this presentation. I know, as Tom had said at the beginning of this presentation, this is the first in a series of timecode and protocol and integration communication classes. And I know that OSC is one of the classes that we are planning on offering in the future. So if we don't cover the OSC questions that have come in today, know that we are absolutely going to be spending some time later talking about some of those. We've had another question that has come in both about SMPTE and about MIDI, which is if you are using a Nomad and you have a SMPTE generator or a MIDI timecode generator running on the same computer that Nomad is running on, could you use that other program to be triggering inside the same computer? And yeah. I don't know if we have an answer for this or not, but we've had a couple of people that have asked it, so I thought it might be worth throwing out now before we go into anything else.
Totally. We do have an answer, and the answer is no. EOS software isn't processing that audio signal, so we need that gateway inline to do that for us. So the answer of using something like a loopback for the audio signal within EOS is not something that we have. So you would need that device and USB or network it into your system.
That's what I thought.
I'll also say, just because it got asked, and a really quick thing on the OSC. OSCs are considered triggers, which again we will do a series on. But OSC is really kind of a one-time event, as opposed to a stream of data like timecode is. So that's why we differentiate timecode versus triggers. You may be able to get the same result as timecode with OSC, but basically timecode is a constant stream of what time is it, what time is it, what time is it. It's just a system telling us exactly the time at any given moment so that we can then respond to stuff. OSC is much more like push the button, do this, and then the console responds to it. So that's kind of the fundamental differences between the two.
So like MIDI show control is closer to OSC than SMPTE would be close to OSC.
Exactly. You send a MIDI note or something, that's going to trigger a thing, whatever that thing is. And maybe it's a macro that turns on internal timecode, right? Like there's no reason those things can't be used together, but sort of the fundamental basis, the difference between timecodes and triggers is the sort of streaming nature of the timecode.
Perfect.
There were a few questions as well, and since we're just talking about MIDI, and then we can get to Nick's awesome demo. And Nick, you've got a lot to live up to now. But some of the earlier generation of EOS family consoles did have built-in MIDI, and so the configuration of that is basically exactly the same as the new MIDI gateway. You go in and you set the groups, the source, but it was built into the console. We elected, based on a lot of research, to say let's increase the number of DMX outputs in lieu of those MIDI ports, because everybody was using DMX and only a few people were using the MIDI. So, and there was also a question that Ashley had about are there any plans for more of a timeline view rather than a list view? And it's absolutely something that gets talked about a lot. It would be really cool to have some sort of interface to see more in kind of a linear time fashion what's happening when and by whom. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled. You never know.
Groovy.
I say demo time.
Great. Well, this is. I feel like we've been delaying it so much that it's going to be really disappointing. I'm going to just share my screen. So hopefully this does what we want it to do. Is everybody able to see that?
Yep, I see your screen.
Great, perfect. Basically, so this is a little show file, which is called Timecode Playtime. And we're going to make it available once this video is able to be downloaded. So this is something that I built over the past week so that you can play with it, and it has some of the macros built and things like that. So don't feel like you have to go it on your own. There's some stuff in here that makes stuff really easier. So so look for this coming out when we post the video. We're going to figure out where it gets set up and everything like that. But really quickly, the key to most of this stuff, right, is macros, right? We looked at our show control list and sort of the events that we can put in, right? Timestamps, actions, labels. These are all of my settings down here. And way in the bottom is the learn. So, you know, if we're wanting to learn or do silent mode or anything like that, the show control tab is where those functions live at. So in order to make them more useful in real life, we want to put them in macros, right? So that if we're in live, we can learn them. So what you have in the macro editor is a couple of things, and I've put them on a direct select on this side of the screen. for a little bit of easier things, and I'll go through a couple of them as examples. The first area are a bunch of macros that have to do with just moving time, right? So when I'm in live and I'm dealing with cues and I want to nudge some time code, I can do that. So that's sort of the first grouping of macros that are really, really useful. And I'll take you through that in a little bit. And then down in my 100s, these are macros that have to do specifically with event list 1, right? And if you look at in my macro editor here, if we go down to 101, these were the ones that I was showing you in the PowerPoint, right? Where for list 1, I'm turning on and off internal and external time code. I can set the clock to specific hour times if I want. I can set them down to 0. I happen to make the event list header, this macro up here, load that cue list to the master fader pair so that I can quickly learn from my spacebar, which is useful in a Nomad setting. So just a sidebar, if you're going to use this at home and you want to learn time code and stuff, maybe you want to load that event list, that cue list to the master fader pair. It may be a little bit easier. Again, in the exact same stuff, if I go to the next page, they're just all for event list 2, right? So maybe this is stuff that you build and have in your base show file, right? I don't need to reinvent this wheel every time I do a show with time code. I can say, oh, I'm using lists 4 through 8 or whatever, and copy those macros out of my base show file so that I have them there. So it might be worth building up all of these macros for every event list number that you think you'll be using and have those readily available to put out. I just did 2 in this file for you to play with. So as we kind of talked about, in order to get time code to show up in our main cue list, I have the external link on my cue list index for time code lists 1 and 2. So that's useful. Let's do, in my playback status, I did a list 1 and a list 2 on the top and the bottom. And if you're using this file, snapshot 1 gives you just this layout, so it's easy to get into. So a quick little demo, just to play with some stuff. If I'm in my show control list and my event list 2, for example, I can run my internal time with that macro, right? And so we see that that's functioning. I can disable that clock running, and that really just pauses it, so it will pick up where it ended. Same thing for when I want to do enable external or disable external. And I'm going to do this in here because we can see it. You can set your clock to specific times. Setting to 0 is a useful thing if you're going to be waiting to hear time code from another source. That just is a cleanup tool. Again, keep in mind resync frames and stuff. You don't want to have your first event be at time 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Maybe you want to have your first time be a couple seconds in. That's fine. As soon as we hear that timestamp, that's when we're going to trigger that go. So these are all just useful tools. And again, they matter list by list. So if I want to set my time for different ones of these, enable silent mode so that it doesn't listen to any timing, we can do that sort of stuff. So good to go. Back out in live and in my cue list index, I just wanted to do a couple of quick examples. If I want to learn time code for list 2, I need a source running, right? So because I don't have a fancy setup, I don't have any sort of show control coming in, I'm just running Nomad. If I start running my internal time clock, you'll see up here that my time code list 2 is running. It's great. And I can start learning events, and this macro allows me to do that. And now that I'm learning, anything that I do, so far as sub bumps, cue list goes, or macro executes, is going to get timestamped. So I'm just going to hit go, and you'll see that I get a timestamp there, right? Go, 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 whatever. And I'm going to go ahead and stop learning my events and disable my internal time so that I'm not doing it. And we can see in our show control list now, if I look at 2/, I've gotten my list 2 actions and my time. Just a clarification for what we were talking about a little bit before. If you're looking here, it says Q1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Much like in our playback status display, we don't show you 1/1. We drop the 1 if you're going to be in queue list 1. So know that this is queue list 1, and any list that's not 1 will get the queue number and the list number. So keep that in mind. The other thing that's really slick is once we've recorded some of that time, you know, if I go back a little bit, let's say I want to adjust some of this time. We ran through it, it didn't hit the beat just right. This is where these macros that are more global are great. And the example that I gave in the PowerPoint, which is like, give me an additional second, right? I have these running in the background so they don't disturb my command line, but you can see that it's allowing me to adjust a second on here. Add 3 seconds, add 5 seconds, add 10 seconds, add an hour, whatever macros you want to make. Those are really great and useful for nudging time. You know, if I were to say Q1 through 5, enter, and now add 3 seconds to them all, right, you'll see that it added 3 seconds to all those queues. Right, so there you go. Other macros that I like are set timecode. So this is just going to be a give me whatever queue I'm on and let me type the time code. And we start at frames and let you, or we start at hours and let you type the full length. So basically, if I want to type out a full time code sequence, I can say time code 12, which would be hour 12, you know, minute 22, 34 seconds, third frame. So that's how I would enter that in. If I only need minutes, I can just say, give me 3:00:00, and that'll give me my 3 minutes. And keep in mind, this is now, Q1 is going to be called at 3 minutes. Q2 is going to be called at 44 seconds. So these don't always have to be in order, right? When it is that time, we will call that queue based on that timestamp. So if you expect them to play sequentially, make sure that your timing is sequential as well. You can clear time code from a particular thing. Don't forget that you have to still go delete that event, right? If I look in my show control area, I still have, oh, it did clear it. Well, that was good. That was unexpected. I was having trouble with that yesterday. So just be cautious that this action gets cleared as well, because it doesn't always display here. And you can still have queues running even though the timestamp isn't displayed in your external links. And the other thing, when you're building these macros, you'll notice my timecode nudge says that these are for 24 frames per second. Anything that you do that you want to say, I want to take an 1/8 of a second, a 1/4 of a second, or a 1/2 a second off, you're actually dealing with frames. I used 24 because it divides up really nicely. So as you play around, you don't have sort of rounding errors. You can go in whole second increments by clicking 1/2 second twice or clicking 1/8 of a second, you know, 8 times. But be aware that if you build macros up to do these timecode nudges, anything below a second is going to require you to know your frames per second and how that divides up. So just keep that in mind. It may be useful for your base show file to have multiple ones of those. So that's kind of the overview. Again, we're going to make this file available. It's super simple, but hopefully it gives you a way to look at how we create these things and maybe start to build your own stuff as you play with timecode. So what else do we want to talk about? Do we have more questions? I can't see any of you, so are there questions where this?
Yes.
Great.
So we have, at this point, we have a number of questions in regards to silent mode.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm going to, rather than trying to ask them one at a time, let me kind of amalgamate a little. and throw some of them in, because there's some people that are not entirely sure how silent mode is actually working,
Sure.
and what are some of the best programming tips for working with and without silent mode. And I think as we have this demo, the last question that came in, which I think is probably going to be the most helpful for everyone, is could you run the time code with your internal clock with silent mode on and off, so people might be able to see the difference?
Yeah, yes, I will do exactly that. I think seeing is believing, right?
So I'm just going to kind of go through some of these, and we'll see them. Does it make sense to program in external link Does it make any sense to program in external link macros to turn silent mode on or off after every song?
Yeah, absolutely, and specifically what we were talking about before, which is just the nature of timecode. I am a programmer by trade when I'm not working at ETC, and my job is to make sure that we're where team lighting needs to be, where the designer or stage management wants us to be at all times. If some other department has access to my system and can move me around, I don't want that. I want that off. And so I think we're talking about timecode, but this is any sort of trigger or any sort of outside access to your system. My job as a programmer is to make sure we're safe and where we want to be. So absolutely, I want timecode to opt in, because of the nature of, if somebody sends me an errant timestamp from Act 2, we're going there. The EOS is going to do that. It wants to respond when it receives that stuff. So as a programmer, I'm going to program in a way that says, automatically turn on timecode with an external link to a macro and a cue list right before you need to start listening, and the same when you're done. Turn it off, wait until we get through the next series of scenes, and then turn it back on again.
So what would you say the advantage of, or let me try and not ask that by ending it in a preposition. What is the advantage of using silent mode over just disabling the timecode?
Yeah, functionally it's going to give you a lot of the same stuff. But silent mode is designed for you to opt out of all internal and external stuff, right? And so that's why we're gonna do this example with silent mode, because you can do it on Nomad without an external source. Basically, if you turned off internal and external time code, you would be silent, right? You're not listening to anything.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. Sorry to interrupt, Nick.
Yeah, please.
One of the big, and this is a fairly new feature, and I talk about this, and I learned about it yesterday. So the big difference with silent mode is, number one, you still see that time code coming in. It's just it won't actually trigger anything. And if you turn off, if you disable that event list, you wouldn't even see the time code because you wouldn't know if it's coming in. Probably more important is you can still learn events in silent mode. They're just not triggered. So you can say, yeah, blast away, send me all the time code you want, but I'm not going to do anything with it, but I still have the option to go in and record events based on that timing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important differentiation in that, again, you as a programmer, you may have a designer or an associate in RBI that needs to see the time code either on a magic sheet or on their sort of taskbar. So it is really important to be able to see that coming into the system. As a programmer, maybe we're working on a scene, but they're running everything else in real time. I might pause, I might enable silent mode just for a couple seconds to get a change and an update done, and then turn it back off because I immediately want to resync as soon as the next timestamp is received by the system, because we've moved on. So I really like silent mode from a programming standpoint. Just it enables you to kind of step out without reconfiguring what the list is supposed to be doing, if that makes sense. So good call, Luke.
We have Anne Valentino, who is surreptitiously joined the meeting, but she just threw in a really great explanation of this, which is that in silent mode there is no syncing period. We're still hearing it, we're just not acting on it. And the example that she gives, which I think is perfect, is it's like watching your TV and putting the audio on mute rather than turning your television off. Right. So when we're in silent mode, we're just not listening, but it's still there and it's still present. Which I'm going to talk about older consoles because that's what I can remember. But I know with older consoles, when you turned the internal time clock off and then turned it back on, it would go back to 0. So that's one of the other things is that there's that sync time, but also if you're dealing with internal, you want to make sure that you have the clock coming back where you want it to. Whereas if you're in silent mode, you're just going to come back in and start listening wherever you listen. Which does lead to a question that came in about when you are toggling silent mode on and off, how does that catch up work? Do we sync and play all of the events that we missed, or do we just play the next event in the list based on where we are in time?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, we only act when we see a timestamp, right? So again, you have to think of timecode as a really, really fast, this is what time it is now, right? So if we went into silent mode or even disabled listening to external, as soon as we turn back on, we're just being told what time it is now. So if there were 5 cues that weren't triggered because their timestamps weren't being acted on, we're not going to run through those like a go. It's more of a go to cue in time, where it says it's now this time. You know, if we look at Q4 and list 2 as an example, that's going to go at 29 seconds every time the system tells us that it's 29 seconds. It's that time. So it's a good question, but it will jump to that location the next time there's a time that we get a trigger for. So, good call.
Cool.
You want to run that quick little? I can run an example.
Yeah. I'd say why don't you? This would be a great time to run the example while I weed through some of the other questions that have come in.
Yeah, I think. Let me make sure I'm going to do this right for you. I should be able to start my internal clock for cue list 1, and you can see that things should happen at second 1, second 2, and some frames, second 6, second 10, second 12. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable the clock, which should start running these events. I'm going to try to, in the middle, enable silent mode. You'll watch the clock in the upper corner keep counting. It'll pass those, and then before we get to 12 seconds, I'm going to disable silent mode so that we can see it catch up. So here we go. Here goes the clock. And already we are at 4 seconds, so, oh, I see what we did. See, I need to reset that clock to 0. So let's try this again. Great, so now we're at 0, so there it goes. So it's calling, I'm gonna put on silent mode, right? At 10 seconds, we should have done it, and I missed turning silent mode back on, but that would have caught us up. So let me try it one more time. Set our clock to 0. Enable internal time. Enable silent mode, 6, 7, 8, and it'll jump to 10, and then it'll take 12 seconds. Okay, I hope that was clear. Anne's metaphor was perfect of, you know, it's all still happening in the background. We're just not taking action on it. We're not doing anything. So I hope that makes sense.
Made sense to me.
Great.
I guess. Nick posted something in the Q&A. I'm looking over my shoulder to read it at my test monitor, so I apologize for the side of my head. One of the things Nick had said, which I think is a great tip to share, is that he always has a list 10, which doesn't trigger anything, but it's always on, so he can see the time code coming in, even if he's not actually taking events off of it. Because the one thing, obviously, that you could notice here is as soon as you were toggling back and forth into modes, you didn't see the clock moving any further.
Yeah, that's a great thing. And don't forget also that Magic Sheet objects, a couple of releases ago, we added a Magic Sheet object that is an event clock, right? So you can have, if you've got 6 timecode clocks coming in, you could build yourself a little magic sheet widget that ties to each of those event lists so you can see how they're contributing. And I love the idea of a phantom event list that doesn't trigger anything, but is tied to the same group ID as maybe a list that is triggering stuff, so that you can pop in and out of programming mode and have a clearer heads up of what time it is. So good work, Robert. I like that.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty cool. Kevin asked if you could talk a little bit about best workflow for learning events based on a device or users in a multi-console system, so that all users can continue to program without interfering with others. Is that in scope for this class, or is that a little outside of scope for this class?
I can talk briefly about it, and that's that all of these events are command line based, so they're based on user. But you've got to be careful because you can learn things across other people's stuff, right? Playback is not user specific. So something like nudging timestamps that were already there or inputting timestamps in my show control list, that's all great because I'm on my own command line. But because playback is global, right now there's not a way to filter that. So if I'm hitting go learning stuff and someone is running another queue list at the same time and they're learning stuff, you're going to learn all the stuff. So I kind of said it a little early on, there's not a lot of filtration right now between these things. And then, again, that's always stuff that's being discussed. So, you know, perhaps in future builds we'll add some more of that. But for right now, you just have to be really, really cautious. In fact, there's a show that I do with my coworker Pete, where we have different exhibits throughout this huge outdoor 14-acre space. A lot of them are time code initiated, and when we learn, we have to have the other kind of pause work for a couple of seconds. So just be aware of that.
Thank
Nick,
you.
if I can jump in
Please, Rob.
to kind of talk a little bit more about the silent mode, and then also answer Vance's question. Are you able to play back the recorded events without a time code source, as in a busking situation? So you can also, it may help some of you to think of time code as like an invisible person sitting next to the console that hits go at that when the clock hits that button. So what silent mode does is it stops that invisible person from hitting go. So you can still hit go. So timecode does not prevent you from hitting go or doing go to queue or anything else in your list. It is simply another device that drives your show forward at the specific time. Is that helpful?
I think to clarify a little bit too, but you know, keep in mind that unless you're in silent mode, right, or timing is disabled or otherwise, if you hit go and you advance the queues 4 or 5 queues or whatever, and a time is encountered that is further back, that is associated with a queue that's 3 or 4 queues back that you already went through, it's going to trigger that stuff unless you have silent mode or unless you're not listening to time code. I think that's a great way to describe it, Rob, is that like that little person is going to hit go at that time, period, regardless of
that queue, right?
List. Exactly. It's not just a go. It is a take this queue in this time, in the queue's time, when this time is played into the system. So be aware that if you need to catch up, go. If time code's still coming in, it's going to take it back to wherever it needed to be based on that timestamp. So this is why having an override for an operator, say, we're disabling time code, we're not listening to it anymore, is maybe really useful as an override.
When using time code, would it be good practice to assert all queues?
I don't think that would matter as much in a single queue list environment. Maybe if you're having multiple queue lists, try and grab control of different fixtures. But it is an in sequence behavior. It's not an out of sequence behavior when we take a timestamp go. So depending on how much you expect to be jumping around, maybe, right? If you expect the show file is going to pop around, great. Yeah, asserting would be good because it would force those track values to play back as move instructions. If you have multiple queue lists, fighting for control of the same lights. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, depending on the sequence of events. But yeah, it doesn't hurt anything in a single situation where you're playing sequentially, which is often what we're synchronizing for. Is more of a theatricalized production. Good question.
Thank you. John asks, in the show control tab, what's the logic for having the event list at the top and the list at the bottom? It's confusing. My brain thinks they should be switched. So when I select the list, that the events for that list would be below them.
Yep, that's just the way that it's been. You'll notice that it's the exact same in the queue list index, right? So our lists are at the bottom. Our individual items are at the top. I'm going to go out on a limb, and because Anne's here, she can correct me. I expect that it had more to do with when EOS first came out, and a lot of EOS consoles still, your CIA is an extension of your physical programming surface. And so having that track from here up and up, you get less granular as you go up the screen, but that's total guess. But we're consistent across our views that have lists and items. It is the way that it is, and it's been that way for a long time.
Thank you. How does silent mode handle catching up with marking if you have something that's marked in a queue skipped when you're in silent mode, but there's multiple queues between them and you haven't hit it?
Yeah, it's not going to break that mark, right? If you deal with marking and you, in your queue list, bring a light up and make it active while it's marked, we'll use automatic marking, right? We'll use the logic of that stuff to trigger that. We're just taking the go on the queue that we are skipping to. So depending on your queue structure, it may be an ugly move. We're not trying to compensate for that mark in the middle.
Yeah. Can you show how to put silent mode into a queue? You'd mentioned when you were running a production, an operator could manually book queues.
So quickly, I'll show you the macro first. This is enable and disable silent mode. So these are macros 109 and 110. I'm using these for live programming, right, as I'm interacting with the system in tech or whatever. But I can use those same exact macros in a queue list. So my macro editor, 109 and 110, you can see that macro is event 1/, that's my whole list, silent mode enable, and similarly silent mode disable, right? So those are what those macros are doing. If I want to put them on a queue, I can say queue 2/1 execute macro 110, and that's going to disable that silent mode for the foreseeable future until I re-enable it. So this was a bit of a bad example. Maybe here I want to actually execute macro 109 because this is my get rid of those. Execute macro 109. So that at the top of my show, this enables my silent mode, and then I can disable it when I'm ready to start listening for timecode, and then re-enable it as soon as that musical number's over or whatever. So it's just using those macros in an external link to be executed by a queue when it goes. Good question.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm looking through the myriad of questions that have come in. One of the questions that it mentioned earlier is that the desk needs to know what type of time code it's receiving. If you silence it, does it remember that?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, Anne said it the best, which is that like stuff's still coming in, and we're just deciding not to act upon it, right? So all of the settings, and again, I think that is when we talked about this a little bit ago, one of the advantages of not fussing with your internal, external. Silent mode won't fuss with any of this stuff, right? So these are settings that should be kind of permanent, certainly when you get into the operation, the run of a show. And silent mode can be toggled on and off based on the state of where you need to be in your show.
Thank you. Cameron had asked a little while ago specifically about the internal time clock. Does that work off of a specific frame rate? Is there a frame rate that comes into play with the internal clock?
Yeah, we'll use whatever frame rate that list is set for.
So you can change that?
Yeah, absolutely. But again, if it's going to be set to be an actual external source as well, you'll want to make sure that frame rate matches your external source. Because again, frames per second 24 is a little bit slower than 30. Things will catch up in a second. Every second things will resync. But if you have things that are like half a second, if you're doing 12 frames in a 30 frame thing, you're 3 frames behind half a second, right? So just keep that in mind.
If you copy a cue, does it copy the time code in the event list as well? So if I were to copy Q4 to Q6, would it copy that timing?
I don't remember where we are in 3.0. Why don't we find out? Yeah, so it looks like we don't have that. And in our show control list, yep, it didn't add it. The only other thing that I think, let me see really quick. Q3, copy to 6. Yeah, it doesn't look like we can include that. And that's not a bad thing.
Kind of makes sense to me as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, good question.
You wouldn't want 2 events to happen at the same time just because you copied a cue.
Yeah, exactly. Great.
Is there a visual cue in the console, or is there some easy way to be able to tell when you're looking at this screen whether silent mode is enabled or disabled?
Yeah, so again, we put that in the time clock readout, so you can see my list up here. If I were to enable silent mode, it's going to show me all of that stuff. And let's run the clock just so we can see it running. So right, I get an indication there. I also think, again, this is a really useful, this will also show up in your Magic Sheet object. So this is something that if you need to keep track of multiple sources that you may have, and I'll just build one really quickly while we're here. Magic Sheet, I'm going to use a timecode object, and I'm going to make that be source 1, which is great. Control-C, Control-V, that's source 2. So now when I'm out in live, I can see what each of those clocks is doing. But yeah, we do indicate silent mode and the state of the clocks with that. Good question. We have about 5 minutes. Do we want to? I'm happy to stick around and answer more questions, I guess. Questions?
I think my dog has a question.
You can't see the Q&A list, but
I got a couple. There's a couple more that are in here, and my dog's trying to ask them as well, so I apologize for that. Is it worth this is kind of a programming question. Is it worth dividing songs in a musical into their own event list, even if they're all going to ultimately play back on a single master cue list?
I mean, I think that's a really good way to work. And I think if you ask 5 programmers, you'll get 7 answers.
Right.
But I think it's really good because you can manage the events. You can go in and clear the events. You can go in and label the event list. Specifically if you're working on new work and things are moving around, or one day they're like, we're cutting this musical number, we're never bringing it back, delete everything in the board that has to do with this. And you're like, are you sure? Like, absolutely, it's going away, it's never coming back. And 3 days they're like, ooh, we're bringing it back. Compartmentalizing that stuff is really, really helpful. There's nothing, again, that EOS requires you to do that, but I think it is a good workflow. I don't know if Luke or Rob have any thoughts on that.
Yeah,
I mean, you talked earlier. Sorry, Luke. You just talked earlier about doing it an hour per song. So I think this is another maybe personal preference way of that concept.
Yeah, and I think the idea of silencing anything that you're not currently working on, right? Or vice versa. But that could be a good way to divide that. Now, with, by doing that, you're potentially adding complexity because now you've got more things to manage and, okay, which ones are silenced, which ones aren't, et cetera. So, it's certainly an option.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a point well made, Luke, is that it is a different way to organize, but it also requires more oversight. And are you willing and comfortable and able to do that? The other thing that I'll say that I meant to say forever ago, but forgot, and here we are. I built this example file with like individual things in each macro. There's nothing to say that you can't build a macro that has multiple things happening if you need to get to a known state, right? So maybe I turn on silent mode for all of my lists at the top of the show during checkout or whatever. You can compound these things so that they're more automated than having to remember that you need to silence 8 lists at the top of the show. Just keep that in mind.
There was a question from Joshua that I wanted to answer with an anecdote. Joshua asked, what's the benefit of using the MIDI gateway over a simple third-party USB MIDI adapter? And you can generally use a USB to MIDI adapter. These are available everywhere from Amazon or music stores. I got mine at Guitar Center. They're great, right? Because they're cheap. I think I paid about $45 for mine. I also spent 2.5 hours yesterday troubleshooting mine because I was trying to get another laptop using a MIDI program to send MIDI timecode into my MIDI gateway to show that today. After a lot of digging and swearing, perhaps, and even a call into support, I'm not ashamed to admit it, we determined that my MIDI adapter does not support MIDI timecode. It does support MIDI notes and MIDI show control, but not timecode for whatever reason. Even more frustrating was that the documentation where I found that didn't even call it MIDI timecode. It said it does not support timestamping. So, what I learned about that, and it's not the first time I've learned the lesson, was you kind of get what you pay for. And, I'm at home. I'm setting up for a thing the next day. It wasn't a big problem, but I'm really glad that I found that then and not said, oh yeah, I'm going to just plug this in and I'll show it to you in front of a live audience. So that would be my answer to that is, whenever you're dealing with a third-party thing, you run that risk. And also, if you're having problems like that and you're talking to Sasha in support, which is who I was talking to, she's very able to help with the MIDI gateway. Some third-party device that I got from Guitar Center is a lot harder to troubleshoot. So that would be my short answer to that.
Point well made.
It's like when someone wants to run SMPTE 900 feet to you, and then it doesn't work very well.
Yep.
I've lived that. That was unfun.
Yep. Well, I know we're at time, and I want to make sure that anybody who's running off the hog, run the hog. Thanks for joining us. I don't know how many questions are still around. I'm happy to stick around. And,
we have a couple.
Do the after hours. So
yeah, we just have a few.
But let's keep trucking.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and turn the recording off.